Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Essential Guide to Latency in Cubase. Today we're going to talk about a feature in Cubase called delay compensation. This is the capacity for Cubase to identify latency within VST plugins, and we're specifically dealing with record-enabled tracks. As we've already seen, for non-record-enabled tracks or non-monitor tracks, AudioGuard takes care of everything for us. We don't have to worry about them. But for live tracks, we've got a few issues still outstanding because we might have plugins on that track that are inherently causing latency. And so when we play the keyboard or whatever musical instrument it is that we're performing on, we're going to suffer, we're going to hit that latency problem. That's what delay compensation is all about. If you're enjoying this series, check out the Patreon link and the YouTube channel member links below. Awesome way to help support me. So let's define the issue. Here I am with a piano track. You can probably hear through the microphone the sound of me physically hitting the keyboard. I've got no problem playing that at all. There's almost no latency. I'm saying almost because I know there is, but it's not audible and it's certainly not affecting my performance. I can play that piano perfectly comfortably and I'm going to be able to play it in time. What happens, however, if I put an insert effect on this track that introduces a significant amount of latency? Now there's a Steinberg product called Imager, which is like a multi-band filter / EQ kind of thing, and it's got a big latency. Let's add one of those. If we just have a quick look in the VST plugin manager, you can see it's got a latency of 5,250 milliseconds. That's over 100 milliseconds. We don't actually have to guess how big it is because the mixer tells us. See this strip down here? This is accessed from the Setup Window Layout button, and you want to engage channel latency. Just make sure I'm not in the way. Yeah, you can see it. So just turn channel latency on and then you'll get this strip, and it gives you a cumulative readout of the sum total of all of the latencies on the insert effects on your track. And because we've got this 5,250 sample latency here, that's translating into 119 milliseconds. Well, that's no longer playable. If I try to play that piano again, it's got a really long, it's over 1/10 of a second, and it's too long for my brain to be able to handle. I'm not going to be able to perform on this keyboard anymore. So I need to be able to temporarily shut that down. That's no good to me from a live perspective. It doesn't help to just bypass the inserts. That doesn't work. The plugin's still loaded and it's still imposing its latency on the track, even though it's being shut down. We're not hearing the effect, but it's still having an effect on the signal processing chain. So bypassing doesn't work. We need another method for temporarily shutting down these VSTs, these plugins, so that we can do some recording and then bring everything back. Well, that process is called Constrain delay compensation. So in order to explain that term, I need to basically explain what delay compensation is. Every plugin that has latency shifts the playback of the song to the right a little bit. In other words, delays it a little bit. Cubase adds all of these latencies up and keeps pushing back the playback of the song in order to be able to account for them all. If you think about it, what else can it do? It needs that time in order to generate the audio, in order to get to the outside world. There's no point playing part of the song before another song, so everything has to wait. And so every latency in the system is a fully cumulative effect. That's called delay compensation. That's what Cubase does internally. It's on all the time. We can constrain that function, and that's why it's called Constrain delay compensation. It's actually in the project toolbar, or it's possible to add it to the project toolbar. Here's our Constrain delay compensation button. If I press that, watch what happens to this latency offset. It's gone. Now this might be ringing alarm bells in your mind because the latency is gone, but the plugin is still on. How can that possibly be? Well, it's because this is a Steinberg product, a Pt.3 product, and it has a feature called Live Mode. Can you see this little blue button that's just been illuminated called Live? I'm going to turn the constraint back off again, and you can see the Live button's gone out. So if a Pt.3 plugin, and many Steinberg products do, have this live feature, then when you constrain delay compensation, The plugin will stay active, it will just go into live mode. What it basically means is it's no longer looking ahead. It's abandoned the part of the processing that's causing this big latency. It's saying, well, I'm just going to put that to one side for now. I can't do that huge, heavy processing, the looking into the future to see what's coming kind of thing. It just doesn't work. It's the latency is too big. And so it goes into this kind of truncated mode called live mode. Only Pt.3 plugins have it. Like I say, most Steinberg do, but it's dependent on the plugin vendors as to whether or not they implement a low latency mode for you. We can prove that Imager is still in use in both modes by playing a chord with that big delay. I'm going to crank up all the high frequency. You can hear all of that really trebly stuff going on. And now I'm going to constrain delay compensation. And all of that trebly stuff is still there. Imager is still in use. The mix console isn't falsely reporting that this thing's been shut down. It really is still in use. It's just all of its latency has been thrown away. Let's have a look at a plugin that doesn't have the live feature. Turn constraint off again. And this time I'm going to add a brick wall limiter. Now, brick wall limiter, as you can see, doesn't have a live feature. There's no live button there. And if we have a look in the plugin manager, you can see that it does have some inherent latency. It's going to be just over 1 millisecond. In our mix console, we've now got a sum total of 120 milliseconds, 119 off Imager, 1 off the brick wall limiter. Now let's try engaging constraint. The latency has completely disappeared again, but now that you can see the image has survived because it's got a live mode and it can basically circumvent the issue, the brick wall limiter doesn't, and therefore Cubase has no option other than to shut it down. So that plugin has been temporarily suspended. Now there's a threshold value that you can set. In the preferences page, if we head over to VST, you've got delay compensation threshold, and you can see that my system is set to 0.8 milliseconds. That's for a very specific reason. And I'm constantly twiddling with these things, but just right now, the reason that that value is 0.8 milliseconds is that because on my control room, I have an EQ effect, this IK Multimedia EQ81. That EQ there has a latency of 0.7 milliseconds. And so I've set the threshold in my project preferences just high enough so that when I engage constraint, it doesn't shut this EQ down. So the control room is subject to your constraint as well. Every single live path that's able to get to the outside world, every record enabled track, and that includes the control room, it is live, they're all affected by constraint delay compensation. Let's prove that super quickly. Go to the preferences, set this to 0.6 instead, and now that EQ's just been shut down, and I probably got quieter. I'm speaking up a little bit now because that EQ has a little bit of signal boost. And so to avoid the control room being affected at all, that EQ that's permanently sat on my microphone bus, I just set the threshold just high enough that it basically ignores that plugin. And 0.8 milliseconds is a small enough amount of latency that I'm prepared to put up with it. That also means that any other insert effect that might be on the live track, the live recorded track, this piano track that I'm talking about now, if it also has a latency of less than 0.8 milliseconds, it's basically going to get through as well. It's going to slip through this crack in the defenses. Some effects have no latency. Autopan is an insert effect with a reported latency of 0. Have a look in our latency value, it's not gone up at all. And so now when I engage constraint delay compensation, the autopan's left alone. Cubase doesn't need to disable it. In fact, because I've got that big threshold, that 0.8 millisecond threshold, autopan's going to get through even if it had a little bit of latency, but it actually has 0 reported. So even if you set your threshold at 0, this one is still going to get through. Send effects are not affected by constraint delay compensation. If I send to this reverb, I've got a plate reverb over here. So if I throw a signal to that, even though this effect has a latency of 1.1 milliseconds, it's not being shut down. Send effects aren't affected by this constraint feature. You'll need to make a decision on a case-by-case basis. If you're performing this constraint operation and you want to do some live recording, is it going to be an issue that there's still a signal being sent to this send effect? Something like delay, for instance, that is very time oriented, you might want to manually bypass the send effect while you're doing this recording. But the net result of all of that is that the piano is once again a live instrument that I can play without losing my mind. Even with that little bit of reverb in there. Hope you found this episode useful. If you did, please hit the like button. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot for watching.